Thank you very much for your very interesting lectures. I would like to refer to Tomek's statement and manifesto for the future. And I'm really grateful for bringing this up, because if we consider seriously the question, the Museum of Avant-Garde or the Avant-Garde Museum, I think we should really carefully focus on conditions of productions or involvement in the local conditions, in social conditions, and the location of institutions. And I think, I'm sorry for being too general, but this is the biggest problem of big museums due to their involvement in their own institutional discourse, in their legacy, in their traditions, and which is, of course, their task, their mission. Yet at the same time, it can be a burden, and which does not really enable to focus on updating the legacy of avant-garde here and now or for the future. And yet at the same time, for me, the Avant-Garde Museum should be the one that should really also not only focus on rhetorics, on the discourse, but on very pragmatical and practical questions related to labor conditions, cooperation with artists, artist fees, working with activists, as you mentioned, also with those agents who are not in the privileged positions as cleaning ladies, security, and so on and so forth. I think this is the very weak point of all large museums that bear the legacy of avant-garde, due to the fact that they are also, as being usually large institutions, are involved in large like state administration or capitalist policy, and that's why there is this kind of gravity that makes them very fragile to these changes. So thank you very much for bringing up this issue.
Thank you so much for this really provocative morning. I'm going to pose this question, I guess, to Maria, because it kind of began when I was listening to your, as ever, extraordinary historiography of this moment. And what I started to think about was how what you did today pointed to historiography of the reception of the avant-garde, and not just the reception of the avant-garde, but the reception and reproduction of the avant-garde. And it made me think that the version of the avant-garde that people needed in the 1960s may be somewhat different than the avant-garde that people needed at the origin of the 1990s. And also to the question of why is it exactly that we, what version of the avant-garde do we need and are we trying to produce today? What is the Van Abbe Museum in the last 5 years actually doing? What is the version that this museum of which I have great solidarity, but I also am wondering, like, what exactly is the investment here? So the relationship here is one of this kind of complex configuration of the heritage of the avant-garde as a subject of heritage. So I'm just curious, and maybe this is a question that others among you can actually think about, because this question of heritage is actually a deeply politicized one for any avant-garde movement. Many of them wanted absolutely to liquidate.
First of all, I actually haven't had, because I only arrived yesterday afternoon, I haven't had a chance. I wasn't allowed to see the collections. I'm going on Tuesday. So I'm a little bit unsure of what things actually look like here. So it's my first trip. Obviously, your question is really, really important, because in fact, internal to your question is a sensitivity to the historical specificity of every moment or act or period of reinterpretation. And so what I ended with a little bit of a whimper, but it was supposed to be a bang, was the idea of this workers' club, which I find so problematic in the way that it's repeatedly reconstructed as though it were like a stage set. And so I was actually thinking about the idea that maybe that workers' club, and this is at the very end, should actually be presented within the museum as a living space. Now, the problem with that is that it's still within a kind of context of spectatorship. So you wouldn't want it that, you know, that the people who work in the workers in the museum would be somehow, you know, presented as a sort of part of the spectatorial condition. However, I think it is really, really important, and I say this as a historian. I'm not primarily involved in contemporary art, as you know, and I'm primarily interested in disseminating knowledge about the radicality of the experiments in the 1920s. But I think that to try to represent them simply in a sort of formal way, even half-baked formal actually, because it's not really operative, is a big problem. And so we have to find some other way to deal with this. As much as I'm somebody who, as you know, is totally deeply attached to the specificity of form, I still believe that if we want to activate these spaces in a contemporary context, we have to really think about what the function of that space was at the time. And so I'm not just saying that the guards and the cafeteria staff and the janitorial staff should be using that space. I'm saying that in addition to them, also the curatorial assistants and the administrators and the curators, because all of those people, if we sort of take Benjamin's sort of argument in The Author as Producer, all of the labor of all of those people is proletarian insofar as none of them own the means of production. And so therefore, I think it would be great to have that kind of a space. My problem is, I don't know what it would look like. I really don't. And I also don't know, I don't like the idea of the fishbowl. But I do think we have to do something besides these kind of Demandian, Thomas Demand type stage sets. Because the sort of facile nature of them. I mean, I think we're beyond the moment where we can say, oh, well, they should be facile because that's all this moment is in our contemporary moment of capitalism. I'm just so tired of that. We're so past that. I think we really have to re-dynamize what these projects were about.
Thank you, Maria, for this, because to use Arseny's metaphor to resurrect for those spaces as Thomas Demand's spaces is like resurrecting a zombie, actually, that can't act and can't really speak about the times. But my question goes to Arseny, because his brilliant book, the Avant-Garde Museology, raise the stakes or change the field where we look for different modes of work with this material. Suddenly, through the act of translation and editing of this wonderful collection, we've learned that in the Soviet Union we didn't only had amazing for avant-garde art and the attempts to create avant-garde, the museums of the avant-garde, as we know, the museums of artistic culture, but also a really profound and interesting culture of the avant-garde museums. Which of course we now can uncover because those are resonating with the curatorial stakes, you know, the interest of the contemporary art curators to include the vernacular, the not only artistic, for pedagogical means, etc., etc. So my question is that, because this was visible in Davidov's, for example, the photograph of the Davidov Marxist complex, that this was an opposition to the avant-garde art, but that didn't resonate in your talk. Would you like to maybe expand on the fact if Davidov really felt the avant-garde art was a threat and should be damned?
Yeah, well, there is a particular problem for me to speak in Western audience, an English-speaking audience, about those problems, because all what we know about radicality of avant-garde is limited by practices of constructivists and Rodchenko and his colleagues, and something pretty close to beautiful objects, but with another functions, or at least Lisitsky as curator. But as far as I can understand, he considered his cabinet as artistic installation, which is completely shift optic of its interpretation. And it's interesting that there was like forbidden part of this movement that started with the negation of museum by avant-garde artists, but then through institutions like artist-run institutions like Artist Culture Museum went to something else. And for me, unfortunately, Artistic Culture Museum was a museum of avant-gardism, not avant-garde museum. Because if you try to understand what they tried to do, this is kind of like logical consequence of desires of each other. Like try to control policy of the museum in order to promote their own works and works of the colleagues, then try to educate masses how to understand their art, etc., etc. So it's like, you know, our really important consciousness or unconsciousness impulses. But I don't think that this was something radically new. But next step that museologists tried to manage was this controversial idea of this sharply critical Marxist exhibitions that from time to time appeared as a first step of Stalinist repression, because in case of Fyodorov Davidov, he criticized very sharply Malevich and some other figures, and it's not logical for contemporary history canon how it's possible that like high level of modernistic art criticized by the museum, and probably the first step of socialist realism. But I would argue that it's a misunderstanding, and what I think Fyodorov Davidov tried to do is to find a new form of representing art that can preserve it somehow on the one hand, but on the other invent particular way of displaying art that shows that all types of art appeared in different types of historical contexts and with different I don't know, political impulses, but right now it works in kind of another direction. So I think that it's kind of meta position towards art, like close to probably again institutional critique or some kind of another vision of avant-garde that go beyond of all this brilliant visual and spatial innovations. And plus to these there was museums of revolution, which is again like very strange thing. If one asked me what is a modernist museum in Soviet Union, I would say probably Museum of Revolution, but it has a lot of differences. It's not curatorial installation, but artistic installation, and it's completely different level of freedom. And yeah, so there are a lot of strange things that were already not attributed to art practices. That's why we cannot think about them in this context, or didn't have opportunity to think about that. But I guess what Thomas proposed with his presentation, those tendencies close to what Soviet museologists tried to do during this period of time. So.
Can I just respond to just one little thing you said? I actually think what you're saying is really very interesting. I just wanted to point out, Lissitzky did not intend the demonstration spaces as works of installation art. They were really about, like making a prototype for exhibition of radical art that seemed to not be able to be contained within just the inherited historical buildings and so on. So it was about trying to create, like almost like a curator trying to create the optimum conditions for the exhibition of art from not Russian art especially, but any kind of art that participates in the kind of advent of abstraction, which was only, say, a decade old by then, as an Esperanto, as a kind of universal language, and that he was really trying to think about the industrialization of art exhibition making. So it wasn't a work of installation art at all, and that's always been one of the great, I think, misunderstandings. The Proun space, the earlier one that Liering did, that is a work of installation art totally in 1923. But by 26, he's really, thinking about prototyping. And it's true that Lissitzky is not primarily interested in, he's not a constructivist. He's not participating in the kind of critique of the constructivists. He is working in a much more international environment. I mean, he's living abroad for those 5 years. But the project, those demonstration spaces really are about typology and so if you were running a museum, you could, or the idea was that you would order one of those kits. So I think that's a really important thing to take into account there, that it's not all installation art.
I cannot agree with you, because what is important for me is a division between artistic freedom and curatorial freedom. There are two different freedoms, and artistic freedom is wider than curatorial. I guess that curator today is a mediator between social, contract, social contradiction, and this unlimited freedom of artist. And that's why probably it's difficult to understand Lissitzky's position with his cabinets, and because I guess it was based on completely different reception of museum and art. It's already into this, and it's not just mediation and producing like better place for showing other art, but of course it is in it as well. But it's a kind of attempt to invent new way of producing art in general. Again, it's like something in between curatorial and artistic position, and inventing space that will be super active independently from all definitions, from all types of art. So, and Proun is about this as well, but not only in terms of optical, vision, but in terms of activating viewer and introducing him or her into this installation. So, I don't know. Maybe it's a very artistic interpretation of Lissitzky, but
I actually don't understand what the disagreement is.
Tomek needs to resolve. There is no disagreement.
It's easier to understand Lissitzky as kind of curator. It's more difficult to understand his installation as artistic practices. And as far again, I guess I read this in his diaries that his main idea was to be artist, but like to express another type of artist.
Okay, just, I mean, we we should move on, but that space, the demonstration spaces, were specifically to present the works that Sophie Cupers had collected and was trying to sell or enter into public collections in Germany. So it really was about a presentation, trying to theorize what an exhibition space would look like that would encourage you to focus on specific things. And of course, you know, Lissitzky does this in the year after he returns from Switzerland and Germany. So he's really working in a sort of national and international framework, trying to, as he always does, juggle many, many different pressures and demands. And he's such an incredibly creative person. I mean, I think it's kind of incredible, his project. And it really was a prototype, not a work of installation art. Anyway.
Is there any... I think we have room for one more question, and we should take a break before the second session today.
Could I ask the question?
Of course.
A question to Maria. The last example you mentioned was kind of reactivation of the function or the ethos, of the original work. But I would like you to kind of the Workers' Club. But I would like you to develop on a bit the issue of reconstructing in art historical sense. What kind of ethics? Because you named ethics in your very title of your presentation. What ethics? What rules and norms should be applied to when one goes on to reconstruct historical, non-existing object?
Do you mean physical reconstruction or the kind of work of reconstruction that I do as an art historian? Physical, like, so if you want to have an exhibition and you want to include... I think it's very difficult to answer this question because it's almost impossible to get away from the notion of a stage set, creating a kind of stage set. And I think that if you're an artist, you can do what you like.
But apart from the Workers' Club, like, for example, those structures by Rodchenko, how would you reconstruct them for art history sake and purposes?
Well, I guess that's a great question. They have been reconstructed in different ways, and in fact, you can see a whole genealogy of their reconstruction from the 60s for the next 50 years, including, manifest, including by Lavrentiev. The ones that are on display right now in Chicago that were in Venice are kind of like jumbo-sized. Totally jumbo-sized. And I think it's because their original conception of them was to be in dialogue with these works by contemporary artists, which tend to be larger in scale, and so that they not be totally puny. I mean, that was my sense of looking at them in Chicago. Of course, I didn't see the Venice exhibition, so I'm at a disadvantage here. But looking at them, for example, the Jorgensen ones were on really high pedestals, which I just thought was... I mean, there was a sort of level of preciousness about those reconstructions that I found really problematic. I mean, I didn't want to kind of really, make my paper even longer than it was. But those works, those reconstructions, which are basically by the VAC Foundation or for the VAC Foundation, are at a level of polish and finish and size that to me is really incommensurate with their tactility at the historical moment of the 20s. Now, I'm not naive that I'm not pretending we can get back to the 1920s, but I do believe in trying, if we're going to be involved in reconstruction, making it explicit that this is, and who is the reconstructor? What is her or his name, or the team of them? Like, not just say that they're co-authors, but to acknowledge that historical distance, and that really wasn't acknowledged. So that's something that I am concerned about.
Would you try to reconstruct the tactility exactly?
No. Well, I mean, that's what, I mean, you know, the Hanover, the reinstallation of the Hanover demonstration space with all that red, which is like kind of burns your eyes if you're used to looking at crummy old black and white photographs. Is a little bit overwhelming because it feels like for the society of the spectacle. Nevertheless, I think that, you know, we have to sort of believe that most curators and people involved in this kind of business are acting in good faith within the conditions that they're working in, and which are always specific, and it's always going to stamp the reconstruction, but that one has to do it in a way that's empathetic, I would say, that has the kind of empathy or humility, and those reconstructions for the VAC, in my view, don't. I think that they're incredibly pompous, which you can do if you're a contemporary artist and that's your project. I have no problem with that. I do have a problem when it's attributed to what those artists in the past were doing, because I'm primarily wanting to honor those artists in the past. I mean, that's what I do. I work on the past. So, but I think if a contemporary artist wants to do it, then it's carte blanche. They do what they want, but then and that's not what's going on here. These things are presented not as originals, but they're presented as close enough to be functioning in that way. And I think that that's a little bit of a bad faith. I didn't really answer your question because I actually don't know how to do these reconstructions.
I wonder what you're going to say about reconstructions of Cobros spatial constructions. I will ask Daniel later.
You should tell us that.
If I may. No, you should. Because you've pointed at me. I mean, the Kolekcjonując reconstruction, of course, is interesting because Kolekcjonując was part of the Dviżenie movement, which was, reinventing kinetic art and op art for their own sake. Just like the participation of Józef Robakowski in the reconstruction of one of the first hanging constructions, the so-called egg one, was interesting because he was a new media artist and a photographer, so he could read. But again, this was a reconstruction done for the sake of a film that treated the Cobro sculpture as if it's a kinetic work of the 60s. So these are the ends of those artists, and we at the Muzeum Sztuki are trying to acknowledge the reconstructors and the year of reconstruction every time when they appear on the display.